Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Sign of Jonas by Thomas Merton, narrated by Tom Mcelroy. The sign Jesus promised to the generation that did not understand him was the sign of Jonas the prophet. That is, the sign of his own resurrection. The life of every monk, of every priest, of every Christian, is signed with the sign of Jonas, because we all live by the power of Christ's resurrection. But I feel that my own life is especially sealed with this great sign, which baptism and monastic profession and priestly ordination have burned into the roots of my being. Because, like Jonas himself, I find myself traveling toward my destiny in the belly of a paradox. Prologue. Journey to Nineveh. This book, which is a collection of personal notes and meditations set down during about 5 years of my life in the monastery of Gethsemani, was not written with any thought that it might be read by persons unfamiliar with the monastic life. Therefore, in writing it, I never bothered to explain the customary events and regular exercises of a Trappist's daily life, and never thought it necessary to fill in the background. But some of this journal may be puzzling unless the listener has at least a sketchy outline of the monastery and of community life in his mind. 2 things are important. First, what the Trappist life itself is, and second, the special force acquired by that life under the momentum of what is called a period of fervor. Much of the meaning of this journal lies in the fact that it has been written at a rare and unusual moment in the history of one particular monastery. The book is not about the monastery, nor about its surprising present condition, but it reflects something of the reactions of an individual caught in the throes of that condition. The average Trappist monastery is a quiet, out-of-the-way place, usually somewhere in France, occupied by a community of 70 or 80 men who lead a silent, energetic life consecrated entirely to God. It is a life of prayer and of penance, of liturgy, study, and manual labor. The monks are supposed to exercise no exterior ministry, no preaching, teaching, or the rest. The only teaching done by the monks is confined to classes of theology and philosophy within the monastery itself, classes attended by the young monks or scholastics preparing for the priesthood. The life is physically hard, but the compensation for this hardship is interior peace. In any case, one soon becomes used to the hardships and finds that they are not so hard after all. 7 hours of sleep are normally enough. The monk's diet is extremely plain, but is ordinarily enough to keep a man healthy for long years, and monks traditionally die of old age. One soon gets used to sleeping on straw and boards. Most monks would find it difficult to sleep on a soft mattress after their simple palates. The life is usually quiet. There is no conversation. The monks talk to their superiors or spiritual directors when necessary. In the average monastery, Trappist silence is an all-pervading thing that seeps into the very stones of the place and saturates the men who live there. Farm labor is the monks' support, and the ordinary thing is for all the monks to work outdoors for 5 or 6 hours a day. When they are not working, or praying in choir, the monks devote their time to reading, meditation, contemplative prayer. The whole day is supposed eventually to become a prolonged prayer, in which the monk remains united with God through all his occupations. This is the real purpose of the monastic life, a more or less habitual state of simple prayer and union with God, which varies in intensity at different times of the day, which finds a particular and proper rhythm in the life of each individual, and which brings the soul of the monk at all times under the direct and intimate influence of God's action. But now, let us suppose that, within 4 or 5 years, several hundred men decide that they want lives of silence, prayer, labor, penance, and constant union with God in solitude. And suppose they all decide to enter the same monastery. Although they do not all enter exactly at the same moment, they come in great numbers continually, and the monastery of 70 grows to 170, and then to 270. Thus 270 lovers of silence and solitude are all packed into a building that was built for 70. Priests are needed to give them their formation and spiritual direction. It takes at least 8 years to train a man for the priesthood, unless he has been in a seminary before coming to the monastery. Meanwhile, to relieve the pressure, 4 foundations, that is, new monasteries, are made. But these new monasteries are staffed with the most capable of the priests in the mother community. Consequently, there are very few priests left at the mother house to shoulder the burden of governing and caring for a community of 270. Hence, they have a lot of extra work to do. Meanwhile, new buildings have to be put up, and the farm has to be completely reorganized and expanded so that all these new arrivals may be fed and housed. Since all this work has to be done in a hurry, many machines are needed. When you have a great crowd of postulants, much work, new buildings, and a small mechanized army of builders all working at high pressure, the silence is not always absolutely perfect. The young monk who makes his vows at Gethsemani in this unusual moment of crisis and transition is therefore exposing himself to something far more than the ordinary vicissitudes of a Trappist monastery. He is walking into a furnace of ambivalence, which nobody in the monastery can fully account for, and which is designed, I think, to serve as a sign and a portent to modern America. The phenomenon which has suddenly happened at Gethsemani came about without anybody's foreseeing it, and without anyone making any logical attempt to control it. It was apparently beyond foreseeing and beyond control, and there is no one in the monastery who does not sometimes find himself fearful when he considers its possible issue. The notes set down in this journal must be seen in this context of ambivalence, of questioning, of supreme spiritual risk. I do not know, and do not attempt to guess, what supernatural issues may hang upon the loyal and successful living out of our special problem in this Gethsemani. But I know that the peculiar situation here has given each one of the monks his own opportunity to share in the mysterious and secret testing of spirit, which was Christ's own Gethsemani. Our monastery was not named in vain for the Garden of the Agony, but I promise not to be dramatic about that side of our existence. I have a peculiar horror of one sin, the exaggeration of our trials and of our crosses. The journal starts with my preparation for solemn and perpetual vows. It covers the remaining years of my scholasticate, my advancement to sacred orders, and especially to the priesthood. It goes on through my first years as a priest, in which I begin to teach classes and give conferences, and then am appointed to be spiritual director of the scholastics. Where does all this take place? In a valley in Kentucky, which is very hot in the summer and sometimes cold in the winter. The monastery was built in the so-called Knob country, about the time of the Civil War. It is a few miles from the place where Abraham Lincoln was born, and my monastic childhood has had as its background the same landscape of steep, wooded hills, broad fields of corn, and rocky creeks where the boy Lincoln hunted and read and meditated by the fire. Lincoln's first teacher is buried in the cemetery outside the monastery gate. The monastery is a huge square building around a central court, surrounded by a flock of large and small, old and new barns, shops, garages, and outhouses, with a large vegetable garden and a dairy farm, and some 700 acres of forest in which I am very much interested, and in which I have a small and unimportant job, which makes me very happy. The most important part of Gethsemani is the monastic church. In fact, it is not only a church, but a basilica. It was decorated with this dignity, much to the surprise of all the monks, in our centenary year, 1949. The church has a long, plain nave, and a simple 19th-century Gothic apse crowned by a wooden steeple plated over with tin. The central part of the nave is occupied by the choir of the monks, where they chant the canonical office, consisting mostly of psalms, during the night vigils, and at various times during the day. Here, too, the priests say Mass each morning, about 4 o'clock. Here the lay brothers and scholastics go to communion. Here we spend much of our time in meditation and private prayer. The central event of the daily liturgy is, of course, the conventual Mass, which is celebrated in the middle of the morning. The celebrant is called the hebdomadary, the weekly priest, because we take turns at singing the Mass for a week at a time. The priest who sings the Mass is assisted by a deacon, who sings the gospel of the Mass, and sometimes also by a subdeacon who sings the epistle. Meanwhile, the common and proper parts of the Mass are chanted by the monastic choir. I explain this in some detail here because a young priest's turn in the sanctuary is, for the Trappist, much as it seems to have been for the Levitical priesthood of the Old Testament, the hinge on which a whole season of his life will turn. It must not be imagined that the priesthood is something essential to the monastic state as such. On the contrary, one can be a monk without being a priest, and in St. Benedict's day, that is, in the 5th century, when the monastic life as we now know it was established in the Western Church, only 1 or 2 monks in each monastery were priests. Nevertheless, since our present monastic liturgy centers on the Mass, and since the scholastics, novices, and brothers can only be directed by priests in our time, it is the priests of the monastery who normally assist the abbot in the duty of teacher, director, and administrator of the monastic community, and who officiate in the liturgy. These tasks, which are not in themselves difficult, are sometimes arduous under the cumulative effect of extra work, summer heat, poor health, and other factors, and so they sometimes demand an unexpected sacrifice. Greater still, of course, are the burdens of the father abbot who has to govern and guide the whole community, worry about its finances, provide for his monastic family, and watch over the development of his daughter houses, the new foundations, and then every other year travel to France to the general chapter. This is a gathering of all the abbots of the order. The general chapter is the highest authority in the order. It is headed by the abbot general. From time to time, the pages of this journal will refer to visitations periodically made by the abbot general, or by a delegate of his, or else by the abbot of Mcelroy in France, which is Gethsemani's mother house. These visitations are intended to preserve regular discipline, to settle the problems that arise in monastic communities, and to prevent more serious problems from arising in the future. They always leave a big impression in the soul of the monk, and sometimes make great changes in the community's way of life. These are not very striking or very dramatic things, but they are the big events in a monk's ordinary existence. His taking of vows, his advancement to orders, his turn as hebdomadary, his work in the monastery, the fast, the feasts, the seasons, the books he reads, the changes in the face of the monastic community, the bare flight of time. There is not much more that a monk can write about in his exterior life, it has usually not been thought worth putting down on paper at all. Much more important are the events that take place in the depth of a monk's soul. These usually keep pace with exterior events of one kind or another. They coincide with the great sacramental moments of life, but at the same time they have a free development of their own that may or may not flow quietly with the calm current of feasts and seasons. I have treated none of these interior developments in great detail. I have sketched them out in a few lines. I have not attempted to keep what is formally called a spiritual journal, although I have here and there attempted to write as best I can about spiritual things. In doing so, I have, of course, tried to put down my ideas in my own words, avoiding all technical terminology. I have attempted to convey something of a monk's spiritual life, and of his thoughts, not in the language of speculation, but in terms of personal experience. This is always a little hazardous, because it means leaving the sure, plain path of an accepted terminology and traveling in byways of poetry and intuition. I found in writing The Ascent to Truth that technical language, though it is universal and certain and accepted by theologians, does not reach the average man, and does not convey what is most personal and most vital in religious experience. Since my focus is not upon dogmas as such, but only on their repercussions in the life of a soul in which they begin to find a concrete realization, I may be pardoned for using my own words to talk about my own soul. These brief notes would have been far more interesting if I had been able to write more about the monks I live with. Some of them are the most wonderful people in the world, but they have a right which I, through my own fault, have lost, a right to their own privacy, to anonymity. I have not even given living monks their real names, except in the case of abbots and of one priest who is a well-known author. I have necessarily had to spare them a recital of their virtues, which would in some way have made up for the disappointment and perhaps the scandal of my own obvious mediocrity. The Cistercian monks made 5 vows at the time of their profession: poverty, chastity, obedience, stability, and conversion of manners. Conversio morum, or conversatio morum. The whole meaning of the monastic vocation is summed up in these vows, which are given to the monk as a means of consecrating his life to God. They deliver him from the uncertainties and cares and illusions that beset the man of the world. They imply struggle and difficulty. They demand complete self-renunciation. They lead to a life perfectly hidden in Christ. They embrace the whole life of man, and all his desires with a singular completeness. One of the most significant of these vows is the vow of stability, which binds a monk to one monastic community. Unless the superiors decide to send him to a foundation, the monk lives and dies in the monastery of his profession. It takes a special dispensation from Rome for a monk to move to another monastery. St. Benedict, like the desert fathers on whom he based his rule, had a very realistic sense of human values. He introduced this vow into his rule precisely because he knew that the limitations of the monk and the limitations of the community he lived in formed a part of God's plan for the sanctification both of individuals and of communities. By making a vow of stability, the monk renounces the vain hope of wandering off to find a perfect monastery. This implies a deep act of faith, the recognition that it does not much matter where we are or whom we live with, provided we can devote ourselves to prayer, enjoy a certain amount of silence, poverty, and solitude, work with our hands, read and study the things of God, and above all love one another as Christ has loved us. Stability becomes difficult for a man whose monastic ideal contains some element of the extraordinary. All monasteries are more or less ordinary. The monastic life is, by its very nature, ordinary. Its ordinariness is one of its greatest blessings. The exterior monotony of regular observance delivers us from useless concern with the details of daily life, absolves us from the tedious necessity of making plans and of coming to many personal decisions. It sets us free to pray all day and to live alone with God. But for me, the vow of stability has been the belly of the whale. I have always felt a great attraction to the life of perfect solitude. It is an attraction I shall probably never entirely lose. During my years as a student at Gethsemani, I often wondered if this attraction was not a genuine vocation to some other religious order. It took me several years to find out that all contemplative orders have much the same problems. Every man called to contemplation is called to some degree of solitude. God knows well enough how much each one needs. We need faith to let him decide how much we are to obtain. My own solution of this problem is the main theme of the present book. Like the prophet Jonas, whom God ordered to go to Nineveh, I found myself with an almost uncontrollable desire to go in the opposite direction. God pointed one way, and all my ideals pointed in the other. It was when Jonas was traveling as fast as he could away from Nineveh toward Tarsus that he was thrown overboard and swallowed by a whale who took him where God wanted him to go. A monk can always legitimately and significantly compare himself to a prophet because the monks are the heirs of the prophets. The prophet is a man whose whole life is a living witness of the providential action of God in the world. Every prophet is a sign and a witness of Christ. Every monk in whom Christ lives, and in whom all the prophecies are therefore fulfilled, is a witness and a sign of the kingdom of God. Even our mistakes are eloquent, more than we know. The sign Jesus promised to the generation that did not understand him was the sign of Jonas the prophet, that is, the sign of his own resurrection. The life of every monk, of every priest, of every Christian, is signed with the sign of Jonas, because we all live by the power of Christ's resurrection. But I feel that my own life is especially sealed with this great sign, which baptism and monastic profession and priestly ordination have burned into the roots of my being, because, like Jonas himself, I find myself traveling toward my destiny in the belly of a paradox. Part 1. Solemn Profession. December 1946 to December 1947. This journal started when I had been 5 years in the monastery. That meant that I was coming to the end of my term of simple vows, and was making up my mind to take solemn vows and stay in the monastery for good. When you enter a Cistercian monastery, you spend some time as a postulant. After that, you are a novice for 2 years, during which you hope to learn the rudiments of the Trappist life and discover whether or not you belong in the monastery. After that, you make temporary simple vows for 3 years. These serve to prolong your probation. If, after these 5 years of probation, you want to leave, you are free to do so. If you stay, you make solemn, perpetual vows. By these vows you consecrate your whole life to God in the monastery. After that, you just forget about going back to the world. By the grace of God, it was easy for me to forget the world as soon as I left it. I never wanted to go back. However, I often wondered if I should not go to some other monastery. This was what is known as a temptation. But at the time when I began writing this journal, I could not be quite sure whether it was a temptation or not, and I was a great nuisance to my spiritual directors on that account. At that time I thought I was upset by the fact that Dom Frederick, who was then abbot, wanted me to write a lot of books. Perhaps I was less upset than I thought, but in any case I did have to write a lot of books, some of which were terrible. In December 1946, I received word from a New York publisher that one of these books had been accepted. The book was called The 7-Story Mountain, and it was an autobiography. As things turned out, it became quite popular. I thought it would, but I did not like to admit it because that might possibly be pride. And maybe it was. I remember when I was a novice, before I wrote the book, I went to confession and confessed as a temptation that I had thought of writing an autobiography, and the confessor found this extremely funny. He said, "Ha, ha, ha! When Chesterton wrote his autobiography, he showed it to one of his friends, and he was told that it didn't amount to much. Now, if that happened to Chesterton, what would happen to you?" And indeed I have been told in set terms by some of the readers of the book that it does not amount to much. I do not say that I expected it to be a good book. I just say I expected it to be popular. All this time I was studying theology, and I was a cleric in minor orders. To be exact, I had been ordained exorcist on the feast of St. Michael and all angels in 1946. And it seemed that I would not reach the priesthood for 100 years. So on the feast of St. Joseph, March 19, 1947, I made my solemn vows. I did not become a better monk after solemn vows than I had been before them, and I went on worrying about much the same things and striving to write a book called The Waters of Siloe, in which I solemnly declared how monks are supposed to act if they want to be monks. I am beginning to realize how much of an impertinence this was. The reason why I wrote the book was that Dom Frederick wanted a history of the order and of the monastery to be published when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of our foundation. But I found myself involved in a discussion of monastic ideals. Perhaps from my own point of view, at least, this was useful. Thinking about monastic ideals is not the same as living up to them, but at any rate such thinking has an important place in a monk's life, because you cannot begin to do anything unless you have some idea what you are trying to do. There is nothing to prevent a monk from praying, even while he writes a book. This discovery did not come to me until I finally resigned myself to being a writer and found out that the job had one big compensation. It brought me solitude. In 1946 and 1947 I did not have a room to myself to write in, and so it did not occur to me to pray while I was writing. The room where I worked was shared by another monk with another typewriter, a canonist working on some involved problem of law. He was, in fact, my professor of theology, and later became my confessor. He was also one of the censors whose penance was to read the pages that flowed with such regularity from my typewriter in those innocent days. Among other things that happened during this year, I had to serve as the secretary of the abbot general of the order when he came to Gethsemani to make an official visitation. Then in July some monks were sent to Utah to make a foundation. During the year I had the job of assistant cantor, which sounds like much more than it is, and during the summer I read books aloud in the dining room of the guest house to the visitors who came on weekend retreats to the monastery. December 10, Advent, 1946. It is 5 years since I came to the monastery. It is the same kind of day, overcast. But now it is raining. I wish I knew how to begin to be grateful to God and to Our Lady for bringing me here. There was a long interval after afternoon work. It was good to be in the big, quiet church. The church is dark these winter afternoons. December 13, St. Lucy. The years since I entered Gethsemani have gone by like 5 weeks. It was a fine...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?